Hey, Jim, thanks for joining us today to talk a little bit more about managers' compensation. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. My pleasure to be here.
Well, you've had a variety of different experiences throughout your professional career. So I'm really excited to dive right in and just hear what is some of the advice and knowledge you'd like to impart to the future managers and planners around comp. So with that, I'm going to walk us through a few questions. And one of the first ones that I would personally love to hear is, when did you first become a manager?
My first foray into management was actually in a grocery chain. During my summer vacations, I became a relief manager and a pre-graduate manager. It's not very pertinent to this because I didn't get involved in compensation, but I was the tender age of 19
Wow.
that led a team of people who were far more experienced than me.
Mm.
My first kind of proper formal leadership was probably during my time in agency. And then the more sophisticated leadership came during my time at Google. I've been an individual contributor for 3 years and then became a fully fledged Google manager in 2009.
Wow. Well, that is a part of both of our professional careers that we share, our time at Google. And I can tell you that, having been at bigger corporations like Google, in addition to startups, comp is still an area where managers have completely varying levels of understanding and expertise. And so, as you think back to some of those experiences, especially as you were starting to look after some of your direct reports, what confused you the most around comp? What were some of the terms or lingo that was thrown around? And also want to hear how you solved that.
Yeah, I mean, you get kind of thrown into the planning cycle with varying degrees of responsibility at Google. And I think the terminology was the most confusing thing, whether it was the acronyms that were being used, um, but everything from discretion to
Mm.
OTE and all of these different types of things come into it, and you just feel a little lost. So if there was ever a tool that would help you navigate the language,
Yeah.
that would have been useful. We didn't have that at the time. Everything was still pretty bare bones at Google back in the
Yeah.
2000s. Um, that was one piece, and the other thing that confused me a little bit, I think, was more mentally, and I'd always been very, you know, comfortable with my salary. I'd agreed my salary. I knew how much I was earning and felt happy with that, and I never understood why folks were unhappy.
Mm.
And then someone said something, and a dear friend of mine who's a strong advisor, it was his words, and he was like, "People are only unhappy when they compare themselves to other people."
Mm.
That was the moment that I realized the folks that were unhappy were the ones that were talking about their comp all the time. And
Yeah.
I was pretty private and kept mine secret, so I didn't have that feeling. Whereas other folks were dissatisfied because it was a topic of
Yeah.
conversation all the time. So that was a real realization about people's motivations and how emotional they could get about it.
Yeah. I mean, there are two pieces in there that really resonate with me. The first is, when you're making these decisions, it's very easy to get lost in the process and just say, hey, this is an annual process that we do. We figure out who we want to incentivize and how that's pegged to performance. And very infrequently do we take that step back and say, these are actual people, right? There's so much context. And that's where a lot of that terminology stems from, right? Everything from comp ratios to historical performance ratings, all of that becomes context that's then used to inform those decisions. So it's very telling, that managers are kind of coming into this very high responsibility, high stakes environment and are kind of looking for that tools and guidance to make those educated decisions. The second piece in there was just around relativity,
Yeah.
right? Because you said this yourself. You don't necessarily think about those decisions in isolation. It's when you start to look to your left and right and say, well, is this fair? And is this equitable? And from a startup perspective, this is where we find a lot of our customers need to invest more, right?
Yeah.
At Google, when we had hundreds of thousands of people in every job family, I don't know if this existed when you were there, but we had this anonymous form where everyone would type in their comp and we'd share the sheet to see how fair is this? And it was thousands of responses, even in the product management side, right? At a startup, that doesn't necessarily exist. And when there are one or two people, that importance for equity across the team becomes even more important. right? And so very, very telling examples around relativity as well. I think an area, and specific to your role at Ashby, we've seen that comp shows up in a variety of conversations, right? Definitely during the compensation planning process, equity refreshes, salary adjustments, and whatnot. But we've also seen it manifest as a part of the recruiting journey, right? Everything from should we go to offer? If we go to offer, how much do we go for? How does this compare to folks that we've already hired? How, in your opinion, how can managers best prepare themselves to be the best counterparts for their recruiting, compensation, and HR teammates?
To me, I try and focus on outcomes. So I have a similar conversation when it comes to headcount planning as I do when it comes to comp planning. It's all about the outcome. What problem are you trying to solve with the hire? And first of all, is there any other way of solving the problem without making an external hire? Quite strange coming from a talent person, but if you do decide you need to have an external hire for a role, what problem is it that they're going to solve? And therefore, what skills and experience attributes and so on do they need in order to fill it? And then you can bring that information through. It forms the job description, but it also then channels into the comparison engines that we have to do our benchmarking, which have lots of descriptive language about the skills and experiences that make up the person at X level. And that should be the basis for you to determine the salary for that role. Instead of what I generally see, which is I want the most senior engineer I could possibly find to do this, to solve this problem. First of all, they might not be interested because the problem isn't interesting enough for them and not compelling enough for them to solve. But first of all, by doing that way, you'll reduce your budget quite nicely by pulling it down to the minimum requirements that you have for that particular problem. And then you'll identify the band. If you've brought it back that way, then naturally the person you hire will be within the band and therefore aligned with the other folks you already have within the band. So it solves so many of the downstream problems that you may face. The final piece in there is those bands are aligned to the structure and philosophy you have of compensation at your company. Whichever mechanism you decided on and how you think about it, stick to it. And here's my talent take on this situation. You get through the process, you found someone that you absolutely love. At the beginning of the process, they were in band, and at the end of the process, they are now outside of band because they're negotiating or they have other offers and so on and so forth. Stick to your structure. Make them the best and final offer that is in band and allow them to walk away if they are not interested.
Yeah.
And here's why. And hopefully this is one of those moments, light bulb moments for people, because they will not be the best person available to you at the higher band you are now almost prepared to offer them. Instead, if you suddenly feel comfortable offering that higher amount, still walk away from that individual. And now, because you've decided based on your experience with that person that you need someone with a bit extra, go advertise the role again at the higher level, the higher band of pay and compensation, and amaze yourself with how much better quality you get than the person you were about to take a big risk on.
I love that. Repeating that back, there is build the infrastructure to scale your team, the bands, the level, so you can appropriately have those conversations with confidence. And second is stick to your principles.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
I love what you said there. Sorry?
And focus on outcomes first, because if you do that bit, then you can't get back to landing in the structure.
Definitely. And this is one of the areas we see, having lack of bands come up a lot. When you don't have that structure, it's very easy for candidates to start to poke holes and say, well, I was getting paid this in my last few roles, and I don't want to take a step back. But as you said yourself, Jim, when you flex on some of those principles, you lose sight of what you command at each of those comp points as well, right? The minute you start to enter into the next level, it's, well, hey, we could actually get an L6 to help with this. And here's some additional scope that they take on that this candidate is negotiating around. So definitely resonates. Can think of a number of examples where that advice would have been very timely for myself as well. I want to shift gears a little bit to the vocabulary and your process around learning around comp. What was one term, phrase, saying, principle around compensation that just changed your mind or perspective around how you made compensation decisions?
I think it comes down to the intersection between performance and comp. Realization that there's pretty much no perfect performance system methodology. And when it plays back through into comp, you have like this assumption, naive assumption before you've got into this deeply that, you know, the better the performance, the higher the comp will be, and the differentiation between them and low performers and so on. It's only when you get under the hood you realize there's an element of forced distribution going on. So it's not so much terminology as understanding the mechanics of the calculations. And once you get that bit, once you grok that, then you start to understand the dynamics of what's going on. And you can start doing compare and contrast across different teams. So if you take one team where a manager has a team of 10 people and they give them all the highest possible perf rating, and then you take another team where the manager's super harsh and 30% have got improvement, and you know, the budget for the raises for the performance-based compensation was already preset. So the first example where everyone gets the highest rating, that budget is just completely peanut buttered equally across the entire group.
Right.
And there's no way for that manager to use compensation as leverage around performance and as a coaching point, leadership points. Whereas the other person can really reward their highest performers because they've done a really good job in theory. Hopefully they weren't using forced distribution, but they were the true ratings that those folks deserved in differentiating people's performance. And the downstream impact of that is critical. So if you as a leader haven't taken the time to get under the hood and understand the mechanics,
Absolutely,
you'll never be able to use compensation as the effective tool it's been designed to be in leading your organization.
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. There are so many times, and this is a part of what our guide helps address, that we're helping managers understand what that interrelation between performance and compensation is, right? And very, classic demonstration of this is the merit matrix. How many people do we have in every rating that we currently have? Where do they currently sit in the band? And how are we going to help the folks that are doing great and currently lower on the band kind of work their way up from that? We also see a lot of examples of the 9-box come up of how do we most effectively use the 9-box methodology. And it really helps to poke holes in that of what do we expect our distribution to be? What do we want every manager to be targeting for this? And I'm curious, this is a follow-up because we get this question a lot. What if you just have a great team? What if you have the best team and you're now looking to have a fair process? How do you respond to that?
If you've got a truly great team and you've measured everybody objectively, that's great. Explain the mechanics to them. You're all going to get exactly the same raise.
Yeah.
Because you've all performed equally as well. And everyone looks at each other and goes, hey, yeah, we all did well. There becomes some psychology to play into that, though. All of a sudden, the next cycle, you might find you've got a fair few people who have stretched ahead of others because perhaps the team was benchmarking themselves against each other and the amount of work they were doing or the performance, the quality of their work and so on. And all of a sudden you get to start to see people who are really trying to differentiate. But you've got to be transparent. You've got to explain what's going on. And again, you need to understand that in order to be able to communicate it effectively. Yeah.
Absolutely. The consistency very much resonates with me, even when I was an IC, because not only are you building that denominator for what fairness looks like within the organization, I think it's also creating more objectivity to the process, right? Which is I know when I'm performing and showing up within my organization in these XYZ ways, here is how it's being rewarded, right? I always say this, even within our own team, which is your comp philosophy is only as strong as it is understood, right? And so you could have the most complex comp or performance rating structure, but until your employees, until your managers can confidently speak to how it works and why it works in that way, you're missing the mark, right? So that very, very much resonates.
I think I have another example of this, which
Please.
possibly goes even counter to how you talk about this in
Yeah.
your and that's raises versus adjustments.
Mm,
To me, those are completely separate situations. But so often I see, and I'm in building mode, right? I'm
yeah.
sub 100 and Series B and so on. So you've got to separate those two pieces out if you're going to use comp effectively.
Mhm.
An adjustment is a change in the overall market, which does not impact your position in the percentiles in the band,
Yeah.
but instead moves the band around you, and we want to maintain where you are. And if someone is getting an adjustment because of that market change, or no adjustment because the market has become static or gone in the opposite direction.
Totally. Or if the company doesn't do adjustments, right? Doesn't keep up with market. Yeah.
Absolutely. You need to be able to effectively talk about that. And that's a critical part of fairness.
Yeah.
Right? Because you're constantly looking at the adverse impact on any particular demographics and so on. So it's really important that you have looked at the adjustment process, even if you decide not to do any.
Yeah.
That's key. But those adjustments have to be communicated effectively. You are not getting this raise because of your performance. You are getting this raise because the market changed.
Totally.
And that's a separate conversation from your performance-based compensation
Right.
conversation, which is, hey, you performed really, really well, and you're getting this raise
Yeah.
or this promotion to the higher magnitude of performance impact, or you didn't perform very well.
Yeah.
You're not getting a raise based on performance. Yes, we just gave you a raise because of an adjustment, but that was specifically because of the market. We want you to stay here. We want you to have a fruitful career. We hope that next year you perform stronger. But you're not getting a raise based on your performance.
Mm,
It opens up so many more avenues for a leader to be able to leverage compensation to help their team grow and to reinforce messaging.
yeah.
But if you lump adjustments and performance-based raises into adjustments into the same bucket, you're muddying the waters. You're losing the capability to utilize those levers, and
Right.
you end up giving someone a significant raise because of adjustments who hasn't performed well, and you're
Right.
reinforcing that poor performance.
Totally. Totally. I love that example.
The way we think about it, and this is always subject to change, adjustments are yearly
Mm,
for the whole company at the same time when we review the bands.
mm,
Raises are on the anniversary of the person joining, and that's their 12-month performance review based on the anniversary. Now, that's key because it means you don't exclude anyone from your 2 planning cycles.
mm.
Everyone is automatically excluded. And where I've seen exclusions happen, oh, we don't do comp for someone in their first 6 months. We don't do comp within 3 months of somebody having a raise. We don't do it. You see that manifests itself in discrepancies and unfairness downstream when you then do the comparisons. So
Right.
it solves for these problems. Anyway, that's my take on that particular element.
It's a great example. And that anniversary-based approach is where managers typically are soliciting the most questions too, right? I worked here for 2 years. Are we, how do I target the next level? Or what does a promotion look like at the company? I also love delineating between where those raises are coming from, right? Whether it's market-based, performance-based, and something that doesn't get talked about enough, in my opinion, Jim, is when the entire leveling structure changes, right? Like, hey, we actually introduced a new role, which is going to create a new level, or we're hiring for interns, which actually changes how we're, going to be paying folks. And that's a substantial update. So I found that companies that take a very iterative approach to their comp strategy and communicate each of these updates kind of in isolation are best preparing their managers for having those conversations with their direct reports, right? Because that's where a lot of credibility needs to be established as well. I want to wrap us up here with one last bit and one of my favorite questions, which is, for every manager that's listening to this recording today, what is your word of advice to help them best look out for their team?
Ask more questions.
Of who?
Of your team. Learn more about them. Understand them. Know what's going on, and build that rapport, that level of trust and so on, to show that you're looking out for them. Because taking the time to listen to their answers is the best way you can look out for them, to build that trust. And then obviously take action downstream on what it is that you learn. It doesn't have to be something dramatic, but show that you listen, that you're bringing the information back and showing that you've taken some kind of action. It doesn't matter if it's about comp or anything else, but you should understand how the person is feeling, why they're feeling that way, what their future hopes and dreams are, and how you can help, what tools and skills they need to develop, and so on. Everything starts with you asking more questions and then listening to the answers.
We all need to ask more questions, and I'm sure my team will be receiving a number of questions today as a result of our conversation. So thank you so much, Jim, for joining us. And I'm so excited to share a lot of these insights and nuggets with the rest of the Complete community. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for asking me.